Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nancy Seidman, and I'm a Senior Advisor at the Regulatory Assistance Project, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I hope you've enjoyed our While You Wait slide. The concept it raises, along with many others, will be addressed in this afternoon's webinar, Opportunity Knocks for Beneficial Electrification. Welcome to today's webinar, Opportunity Knocks for Beneficial Electrification. Today's presenters will discuss how beneficial electrification can deliver numerous important benefits if it is well planned, targeted, and executed. First, I want to cover a few logistics. We look forward to your questions and ask that you please type them into the questions pane on your GoToWebinar control panel, which is located on the right of your screen. This slide depicts that panel. We will pause during the presentation for brief clarifying questions and will address other questions during the Q&A session after the presentation. The official portion of the webinar will end at the top of the hour, but we will stay on the line for up to 30 minutes longer for anyone who has additional questions and would like to continue the discussion. Now I'd like to introduce today's webinar presenters. First to speak will be Ken Colburn. Ken is a principal at RAP. He advises energy and environmental regulators on air quality and climate-related issues, as well as on opportunities associated with regulatory compliance, energy efficiency, and other energy policy matters. Ken's efforts currently focus on beneficial electrification and streamlining energy and environmental regulation. Our second presenter is Jim Lazar. Jim is an economist and senior advisor to RAP. For most of his 30-year consulting practice, he has served as an expert witness for state consumer, low-income, and environmental advocates, and for progressive utility regulators. He specializes in rate design issues and has worked extensively on resource planning, incentive regulation, and revenue requirement analysis. Ken, now I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Today's webinar is about beneficial electrification. So let's start with some background on what electrification is and why it's important. Electrification just means, as indicated here, applying electricity to end uses like water or space heating or transportation that would otherwise be powered by fossil fuels. Why is it important? For a number of reasons, not least because electrification is already happening due to rapidly advancing technologies. This is creating new business opportunities for utilities and others, both in load growth, new services, and customer engagement. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, for instance, projects that electric vehicles may represent 35% of new car sales by 2040. Others suggest it may even happen sooner. Second, we all recognize that along with these opportunities, the electricity grid faces increasing challenges, including integration of distributed energy resources, or DERs, as illustrated in the California ISO's famous duck curve. But as Jim Lazar's Teaching the Duck to Fly papers show, electrification can provide new ways to help meet these challenges. Finally, the critical environmental importance of electrification is evident in the fact that virtually every major study or roadmap to address the threat of climate change has reached the same conclusion, that increased electrification is necessary for deep decarbonization. But not all electrification is created equal, which begs the question, when is electrification beneficial? We consider a project or a measure to represent beneficial electrification if it meets one or more of three criteria without adversely affecting the other two. Those are, it saves money for consumers over the long run, it reduces environmental impacts, and it enables better grid management. Let's look briefly at each of these three criteria. Saving customers money in the context of beneficial electrification means that over its life, An action results in a total lower cost to provide the energy end use, the heating, the mobility, and so forth, to the consumer, as long as that's done over the long run, not the short run, includes the cost of acquiring and maintaining the appliances or vehicles or so forth being electrified, includes any incentives that may be provided, and also includes utility bill savings from many time of use or ancillary services benefits that the measure creates. Reducing environmental impacts in the beneficial electrification context means that the marginal emissions of the grid with the beneficial electrification measure is lower, that's to say cleaner, than the emissions of the fossil fuels that are being replaced in providing that customer end use. Again, over the life of the appliance or the vehicle that we're talking about, based on accepted resource planning criteria and including the grid flexibility that may have been created. Environmental impacts are typically measured as CO2 emission, carbon dioxide emissions, for clarity and convenience, but the same benefits also apply to criteria and toxic air pollutants as well as water use. Regarding environmental impacts, it's important to note that beneficial electrification measures get cleaner over time as the grid gets cleaner. This EIA graph shows how the carbon intensity of the electric power sector has improved dramatically over the last decade. And as a result, as illustrated in this graphic from Exergy, while a natural gas water heater's emissions efficiency, or emissioncy as we call it, will remain level over time, assuming its performance doesn't degrade, an electric water heater's emissioncy will improve over time to become as clean and then cleaner than a gas water heater. And a heat pump water heater has even better, quicker emissioncy performance. Third, beneficial electrification also improves the grid operator, giving him greater flexibility to manage load, improve demand response, integrate higher levels of renewable, non-dispatchable generation. This can occur if some or all of the load can be controlled by the grid operator, such as through grid-integrated water heaters, smart thermostats, or controlled water pumps. Consumers can program their loads to take advantage of time-varying rates. That's another way. And if the load shape of the measure, by its very nature, fits the output of low-cost resources, like street lighting load, which largely occurs off-peak. Some utilities and regulators may look at electrification simply as load growth, but we believe that smart utilities can get a leg up by approaching a beneficial electrification consistent with these three criteria. RAP coined the leg up acronym to reflect additional load and more service opportunities and lower costs for consumers. The E is the lower environmental impacts, and the G, of course, better grid management. In fact, we did a 4-part blog post series explaining this leg up opportunity, which is available at the website shown or just at RAP's, via RAP's website. I'll stop here and turn it back to Nancy to see if we have any questions thus far, and Jim will continue after that.
Thank you, Ken. We do not have any clarifying questions so far, but one question that we've received that I thought maybe you and Jim can ponder to answer later is, what can city governments do to accelerate beneficial electrification? So let's hold that one for after we get through the slides. And I think Jim, if you're ready to go, we're ready to hear from you.
I'm ready to go. Are you hearing me? Good.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to go through some quick examples of things that fall under the category of electrification and generally beneficial. The first is converting from electric resistance water heat to heat pump water heating. This saves about 70% of the kilowatt hours, and the heat pump water heater only needs to run 2 or 3 hours a day to provide a day's worth of hot water, so it can be controlled into the low cost and low emission emission hours. But they don't work everywhere. The next is oil or gas space heat to heat pump space heat. Oil and gas heat are 60 to 95% efficient. Heat pumps are 200% efficient in colder climates, 300% in warmer climates, and can provide significant net energy savings. Another device that's becoming available on the market is the heat pump combined space conditioning and water heat system, in which in the summer when you need air conditioning, the heat pump is taking heat out of the house and putting it into the water heater. So one heat pump provides both your heating and cooling, but also your hot water. And this won't work everywhere either, but it's a terrific system. Next, and Ken mentioned this, electric vehicles. Internal combustion systems are, less than 25% well-to-wheels efficiency, simply because internal combustion engines aren't very efficient. Electric vehicles are more like 75% efficient from the plug to the wheels, but it matters quite a bit where the electricity comes from. Because EVs only need to charge 2 or 3 hours a day, they can be controlled into the low cost and low emission hours of the day. Now there's a more challenging one, converting gas or propane or oil water heat to electric resistance water heating. As I'll show, this can be a beneficial electrification move if done right, if the grid is a low carbon grid. Because the water heaters only need to run 2 or 3 hours a day, they can be controlled into the low-cost hours. They can also provide ancillary services to the grid. Now, I'm going to spend a little time on water heat because I think it's really important. It's easy to spot an electric water heater. This is minute-by-minute use in the house in Seattle. The green is the output of the solar system. This is on January 8th, so there's not much. The 4 big red spikes are the water heater coming on, a telltale 4.4 kW jump in consumption. As you can see, it doesn't run very many minutes of the day, and because the tank holds a day's worth of hot water, these can be scheduled into the low-cost, low-carbon hours of the day. No, you don't run out of hot water under controlled water heating. This is a 50-gallon tank in a condominium in Hawaii, so a relatively small tank. It wakes up in the morning full after charging from 1 in the morning until through 6 in the morning. They're in red. People use hot water in the morning and draw down the storage in the tank. And then once the sun comes out and solar systems are producing excess electricity in Maui, the water tank charges back up again, and as the sun comes down and people come home and start using hot water again at the end of the day, the hot water is drawn down. No point is this tank below 50% charge. So if the tank is sized right and the controls are operated carefully, feeding power to people who need power if their hot water use increases, you don't run out of hot water. Now, the ancillary services function is extremely valuable to the grid. This graphic shows in red the PJM frequency regulation signal, and in blue a fleet of electric water heaters being turned on and off in order to support the grid, turning off when the frequency sags, turning on when the frequency surges. Water heaters can respond faster than any power plant can do in supporting the grid with frequency regulation services. Now there's a lot of existing electric water heaters in the country, as much as 60% in the South, about 45 million. But more than half of the water heaters in the US are still fossil. This means there is a huge potential for water heat to provide benefits to the grid. Each water heater can provide the shaping and storage needed for about 2.2 kW of wind or solar, taking whatever power they produce at times that is inconvenient to the grid. With 45 million existing electric water heaters that could be converted to grid integrated water heating. That would enable adding about 100,000 megawatts of wind and solar to the grid. If we converted the 66 million gas, propane, and oil water heaters, that would enable another 140,000 megawatts of wind and solar. When power comes in at valuable times, it would go to other purposes, our lights and computers and so forth, and at less valuable times, it would be directed into the water heaters. Today's wind and solar is only about 85,000 megawatts, so this would allow us to more than quadruple the amount of solar in the United States, solar and wind in the United States grid. I'm going to pause here, Nancy, if there's clarifying questions at this point before I go into some more detailed numerical stuff.
Okay, yes, Jim, actually there are two clarifying questions for you. Let me ask them one at a time. One is, what would you say is a very cold climate? Do you think of New England, for example, that way, or the upper Midwest?
Certainly, you know, Vermont and North Dakota and eastern Montana are very, very cold climates, and those are areas where heat pump technology works least well. You know, basically, if you have more than about 7,500 heating degree days, I'd classify that as a very cold climate. There are new heat pumps that are coming to market that perform better at those temperatures, but you won't get the same performance you'll get in Georgia or California.
Okay, great, thank you. And the second one is was a question when you mentioned greater than 100%, or you mentioned efficiency a couple of times, and the question was efficient compared to what?
And
what are you using when you say?
Heat pump efficiency is measured on the basis of how many BTUs of useful output do you get relative to the BTUs of electricity input that you receive. So a kilowatt hour is 3,413 BTUs of energy, and if the heat pump can put out 10,000 BTUs of hot water or space heat with that, then that's about 300% efficiency. But it matters a lot where the electricity has come from. If the electricity has come from burning 10,000 BTUs of coal, then you've got 10,000 BTUs delivered to the heated space for 10,000 BTUs of raw energy. That's why I say it matters a lot where the electricity comes from, and I'll get into that in this next section.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim. Why don't we forge ahead?
Alrighty. So beneficial electrification is quite different from energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is crucial, but it's different. It means using fewer, energy efficiency means using fewer kilowatt hours to do a task, or fewer therms of natural gas, or fewer gallons of oil. That's a good thing. Beneficial electrification often means using fewer joules, less raw energy across all fuel types, but often means using more kilowatt hours for those things for which electricity is a more efficient fuel. We've coined the term emissioncy to measure the emissions efficiency, how much CO2 is emitted by the project versus alternatives. I'll go through one example in some detail here of converting oil space heat to a heat pump. The customer is using 600 gallons of heating oil a year. That's about 80 million BTUs of oil. If their older oil furnace that needs to be replaced is at about 75% efficiency, then they're getting about 60 million BTUs into the heated space. And that's about what my house uses a year in BTUs. So if we figure that out, that's 6.4 tons of CO2 emitted by the oil. If instead we install a heat pump, and it's a warmer climate calculation, with a coefficient of performance of 3, typical of Energy Star heat pumps today, that customer is going to need 6,000 kilowatt hours a year. If it was coming from a grid that's 100% coal, it's a minuscule or negligible improvement. But if it's coming from a grid that is anything cleaner than that, say 100% gas, it's about a 60% reduction in CO2. And every grid in the United States is less than 100% coal. It's kind of a worst case. So we're going to say, yes, this meets the lower carbon criteria. But what about the cost to the consumer? This is also important. The heating oil was costing that customer $3 a gallon or $1,800 a year. The heat pump 6,000 kilowatt hours at the national average residential rate of about 12 cents, $720 a year. So this customer is saving a little over $1,000 a year and can pay off the heat pump conversion in 3 to 6 years. So we're going to say, yes, this meets the cost to consumers criteria. Now, the electric system fuel mix that's being used to serve electrified loads is changing over time. I'm going to give one example for Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the nation's largest public power utility, that has published its system resource mix expectations very clearly. In 2013, it was 42% coal and had emissions of 968 pounds per megawatt hour, about a pound of CO2 per kilowatt hour. By 2020, the coal will be cut in half, the renewables will increase, and it will be down to estimated 588 pounds a megawatt hour. By 2030, the coal will all be retired, replaced with renewables, natural gas, and energy efficiency, and their carbon will be down to 136 pounds per megawatt hour. That's about an 80% reduction, quite dramatic. So let's take a look at emissioncy for a couple of measures with LADWP systems, starting with gas water heat. In blue is the BTU the CO2 per million BTUs for a natural gas water heater. In black, those emissions from if it were converted to an electric resistance water heater at the LADWP 2013 average resource mix. And then by 2020 and 2030, that system is cleaning up. And the emissions of an electric resistance water heater by 2030 would be about 1/5 of what those were for the gas water heater. If instead we look at converting to a heat pump water heater, which worked terrific in the Los Angeles mild climate, if you have the location to put it in your home, benefits immediately from converting the gas water heater to heat pump, and those benefits increase over time. Now, these are calculated on the average mix. What really matters is the marginal fuel mix as things change, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this section. Turning to automobile travel, even at the 2013 fuel mix of half coal and a quarter gas and a quarter non-carbon resources, the emissioncy for automobile transportation, particularly in the stop-and-go traffic of Los Angeles, where electric vehicles really shine, the dramatic improvement compared to the petrol automobile. But by 2020 and 2030, the emissions from the electric automobile will become significantly lower as the grid cleans up. Now, rate design matters a lot to the consumer cost effectiveness calculation. I'm going to give an example for electric vehicle charging. Southern California Edison, one of the nation's largest electric utilities, has a standard rate that is a 3-tier inclining block rate. Almost everybody uses their first tier for essential needs, refrigerator and lighting and televisions, things like that. So any additional consumption for the consumer would occur in tier 2 or tier 3, and they'd be paying 25 to 31 cents a kilowatt hour. Really not much savings over the cost of gasoline. But SCE also offers a TOU rate, and a TOU rate has an off-peak rate of 13 cents a kilowatt hour. This is a rate that will save the electric vehicle owner 50% compared to the cost of gasoline. The time of use rate is a good option for the EV customer because they can control when the EV charges. If off-peak is defined as the middle of the day, they can charge it in the middle of the day. If off-peak is the middle of the night, they can charge it overnight. All electric vehicles include charge controllers. Now, we are seeing some very, very interesting new technology emerge. And it's really quite promising in some areas. I'll illustrate the ultrasonic clothes dryer recently announced by U.S. Department of Energy in cooperation with one of the largest appliance makers. It uses sound waves to shake the moisture off of our clothes instead of heat to evaporate the moisture from our clothes. It produces about an 80% reduction in electricity consumption compared to a conventional electric dryer. And here we're looking in the door of it, and you can see the electronics on the inside of the prototype model. Now let's look at the emissioncy of this. In the middle, I've got a gas dryer showing the carbon emissions for a million to dry a load of clothes. The electric dryer with LADWP's 2013 resource mix, much worse than a gas clothes dryer. The conventional electric dryer with LADWP's 2030 resource mix, much better than a gas dryer. But look at the ultrasonic dryer. Dramatically better than either the gas dryer or the conventional electric dryer. We do need to make room for, expect, anticipate, plan for, and encourage new technology. It's part of our answer for the future. Now going to go to finish up with a fairly complicated table, and we'll leave this up during the question period so you have more time to understand it. Across the top, I have 5 illustrative power systems in which the marginal resource on the system to serve load is, from left to right, 100% coal, 50% combined cycle gas. In the middle, 100% combined cycle gas. Next, 50% gas and 50% non-carbon. That could be renewables or nuclear. And on the far right, 100% non-carbon. Then I've evaluated half the examples that I've gone through: oil to heat pump, natural gas to heat pump, water heating from gas to electric resistance, water heating from gas to heat pump, clothes drying from gas to ultrasonic, and the automobile. Where it's pink or red on your screen, the electrified load is worse than the using fossil fuels directly. Where it's yellow, it's about the same. Those that are in green, which includes all of these end uses once the grid gets to a low carbon state towards the right of the screen, green means that electrification has less carbon than the fossil fuel alternative. Now I'll highlight sort of the worst of these, the gas to electric resistance water heater conversion. A system with marginal resources, coal, would have 4 times as much carbon emissions as a gas water heater. Even at 100% gas, it would be worse than an electric resistance water heater. But once we get to a low carbon state, as the California utilities are, the Hawaii utilities are committed to, and some other utilities are moving towards, even this relatively inefficient use of electricity is emissions. And remember that this is the resource, the electric resistance water heater, fits in any apartment, it goes anywhere, it's easy to control, it can provide ancillary services to the grid, so there's some benefits there. Once we get to where the marginal resource is quite clean, it's very attractive. I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Nancy for questions. Once we get going, I'm going to back up to that slide so you can stare at it a little more.
Great. Thank you, Jim, very much. For those on the phone, I just wanted to note that we've gotten quite a lot of questions, so I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. We will do as many as we can in the time allotted. But what I'd like to start with, and perhaps for both Ken and Jim, is so we've heard about some of the benefits of beneficial electrification. Could you discuss or elaborate on how those who are on the webinar might proceed if they want to act on the things we've discussed? For example, you know, there's state policymakers, there are utility folks on, there are federal folks on, there are a number of advocates of, from various stakeholder groups, or anyone else. What's your reaction to that question?
I'll let Ken go first.
Okay. Nancy, this is a great question, of course, but it naturally hinges on which of those chairs you mentioned that an individual is seating in, because the steps available to them will depend on that. Among the most important, of course, would be the utility regulators out there, and I think that we should consider electrification as kind of a sizable iceberg. So there will be many, many opportunities where you can promote or contribute to greater electrification. And I'll name a couple of them, but I don't want to suggest that they're at all comprehensive or all inclusive, and I imagine Jim will have many more. One is that it's often the case that utility commissions regard load building activities by utilities as below the line expenditures. That's something you can pay for out of your shareholder money. You're not going to bill ratepayers for that. In this case, given if the electrification adhered to the three criteria we described, and Jim demonstrated in this example, it may actually reduce costs, and so it might be a good idea for the system as a whole, not just for the participants. So regulators may actually want to revisit that below the line constraint to allow greater electrification, greater load growth, as long as it adheres to those three criteria. An example of that is one I'm familiar with in the state of Vermont, for example. Its commission determined, actually its legislature, determined that utilities should work on electrifying space heating over time, and built kind of an RPS-like threshold or requirement that utilities have to adhere to in terms of electrifying space heat in their customers' homes. So there are two small ways on this big iceberg that utility regulators could approach this. Utilities can obviously come in with proposals that meet all three criteria. Advocates and others, government officials can work to promote the concept and insist that it meets those criteria. Thank you.
I'll add a couple of things to that folks should look for. First of all, study the resource mix in your region. What is the marginal resource at different times of the day? I've done this for a number of utilities, and we found sometimes the marginal resource at night is coal. Well, if that's the case, then things that shift load to off-peak hours are going to increase emissions, not decrease them. So learn what the resource mix is. Next, regulators need to look at rate design to make the low carbon hours the low price hours if we're going to move loads into the low carbon hours. And on most of our customers in the US are not on time varying rates. That's changing, but as we roll out time varying rates, both optional rates or default rates for some or all customers, let's make sure that the pricing matches up with the expected emission profile of the utility over time. Third area is energy codes. State energy codes could require that new electric resistance water heaters or new electric water heaters of any kind be grid integrated, meaning capable of being controlled into the low-cost, low-carbon hours. That's an example of one thing. Some states have codes that discourage electric space heating or water heating. Those may need to be updated to enable builders to put in efficient electric systems and emission electric systems. And finally, utility programs. We have currently in the U.S. some utilities with programs paying customers with ratepayer dollars to convert from electric to gas heat. As the grid cleans up, it may be time to turn some of those programs around to convert from gas heat to efficient electric space and water heat. Nancy?
Thank you both. I also want to note we're getting a lot of questions about some of the assumptions behind the numbers we have in our slides. So perhaps Ken and Jim, we can work when we send out the recording of the slide to help people understand the background numbers. I mean, think rather than answer, there's probably 6 or 8 questions about different slides and the assumptions that go into them. So I'm raising this rather than go back through each of those slides. Perhaps we can, why don't we work for a way to get that information out to folks.
Will be measure specific and region specific. So the examples that we used will probably not be accurate for any particular location. And so folks will need to do this kind of analysis for their own locations.
The technology.
And you would recommend that folks.
I'm sorry, Nancy. The technologies.
No, go ahead.
Technologies, of course, will be quite similar in their performance, but the fuel that they're using, what kind of electric system, in the slide that's showing now, where Jim has illustrated 5 different kinds of systems, will be critical, and that, of course, will vary not only by region, but also, as Jim indicated, time of day. So studying your system, as he indicated, was very good advice.
Yeah, the consumer cost effectiveness will be very different in high-cost regions like California and New England than they are in low-cost regions like the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest. But at the same time, the emissions will be very different in different regions of the country. And so this electrification will only be beneficial where it meets the criteria, and that won't be every measure in every location.
Jim, I think since you just ended with that, why not, if you mentioned that not all electrification is beneficial, and so if you'd like to elaborate on that a little bit more, why don't you do that now, and then we'll come back to
the summary slide here up, and it shows that, for example, electrification of natural gas to heat pump is not emissions beneficial until a system gets to no more than about 800 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. That's significantly less than the national average today. So that's going to be attractive in a clean climate like a clean region like the Pacific Northwest or California, where wind and solar are providing a lot of the incremental power, but probably not in the vast majority of the country at this point in time. If those grids become cleaner over time, that could change. The electric resistance water heater is not emissions efficient until the power system becomes really very, very clean. And there are only a few regions of the country where that is true today. But because the electric resistance water heater can be controlled into certain hours of the day, for example, in Hawaii, they are curtailing solar during the day and wind at night at times. And if the water heater can be controlled into those hours when wind is being spilled or solar is being curtailed, even though the average emissions of the grid is not attractive, if you can control it into the hours when the marginal resources are clean, you can achieve emissions efficiency. and also provide the ancillary services to the grid, which are quite valuable. There is a great paper on that topic alone called The Hidden Battery that was published by Brattle Group in conjunction with NRDC and National Rural Electric Co-ops Association that I recommend to look at the issues around electric resistance water heat. Not an efficient use of energy, but it carefully controlled a very efficient use of energy.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. I'd like to go back to the question we got about city governments and what they might do to accelerate beneficial electrification. Would either of you like to, who would like to start off?
Well, I'll start because I've had a city council member in the family in the past and know a lot about city governments. One thing that cities can do is in some states, cities have building code authority, and if the city has building code authority, then it can modify those codes to make emission fuel choices the attractive fuel choices. Cities also regulate the franchises for gas and electric utilities in most areas, allowing or not allowing their facilities under and over city streets and rights of way. And cities may decide to not have natural gas extended into new development areas because in the long run it won't be the right choice for to meet the three criteria. Finally, city governments have very substantial energy use on their own facilities, and reviewing that energy use for the city buildings and maintenance facilities and vehicles, particularly vehicles, something many cities are already doing, but pressing the electric utility to have a time varying rate available for cities to use for electric vehicle charging can make a significant difference in a city's own emissions. Ken?
Yeah, Jim's given a really good list there. I think all I would add is many cities, of course, also have their own electric utilities, municipally owned utilities. And there I think that city government has even more opportunity because those utilities can put forward the kinds of electrification technologies that we've just mentioned. They can certainly describe their system and indicate what different measures would best meet the three criteria. And then the city can proceed with the usual assortment of sweeteners, such as incentives that are used now in utility DSM programs. The whole issue, I think, of determining when a measure is beneficial sounds complex, particularly in learning your system, but the actual implementation of policies associated with it, I think, is not difficult because it gets to the simple kinds of codes and incentives and rate designs, time of use and so forth that Jim mentioned. It's knowing what to aim at. It's a better form of targeting more than it is a whole different policy palette. Thanks.
Ken just prompted me to think. The city of Palo Alto, California is probably a leader in this area. Palo Alto has a municipal electric utility, but also a municipal natural gas utility. And their electric utility is very much at the clean end of the spectrum already. It's essentially coal-free. It has a lot of hydro. It has a lot of wind and solar, and it has natural gas as its inefficient power plants as its swing fuel. And they are studying, in essence, they're studying over what period of time should we phase out natural gas service. The studies show that they can't get to their carbon goals with natural gas as a space and water heating fuel. So over some time, they're looking to convert substantially all of at least their residential natural gas loads off of fossil fuels. Nancy?
Great, thanks. I want to come back to time of use rates, but Not quite yet. At first, we've had a couple of questions about whether the slides will be available, and yes, they will be. Everyone who registered for the webinar will receive the slide deck and access to the recording hopefully tomorrow. So you can stop taking frantic notes, those of you who indicated that. But before we get to time of use, we've had a number of questions about customer charges, high customer charges, impacts on costs to consumers. I know that will merge perhaps into time of use, but in general, if we expand electrification, what do we think that would do for customer charges? And how can we talk about impacts on cost to consumers, for example, if they're switching their own appliances or thinking about from gas to electric?
I'm going to take the customer charge question as the fixed monthly basic service charge on the electric bill. And that should not change over time as a result of electrification or non-electrification. Most regulators have adopted the principle that the customer charge should cover only the customer-specific costs on the grid. Generally, the meter reading, billing, collection, customer service. And those costs don't change with usage. It's between $5 and $10 a month is a cost-based customer charge. Some utilities try and some self-regulated utilities succeed in including distribution costs into the monthly fixed charge. That's inconsistent with the policies of the vast majority of state regulators. Certainly inappropriate for an urban utility. The rural utilities are a little different situation. But as a simple answer, the level of electrification or the level of electricity use of the customer should not affect the customer charge. That's appropriate for any given utility.
And just to pile on, what Jim's just described is a pretty fundamental component of rate design. And the larger rate design issues Jim alluded to earlier certainly come into play. Customer charges are an important piece of rate design, and as are the allocation of the costs initially that he mentioned, which ones are associated with customers and which ones shouldn't be. As Jim indicated, there's been some gray area there at best, perhaps abuse at worst. And one of the reasons that there has arguably been more of that with the direction of higher customer charges is the reduced volumetric sales that have been occurring due to efficiency. And electrification has the opportunity, at least, to slow down the reduction in volumetric charges, to take some of that pressure off. Hopefully, utilities use the grace period that pressure relief provides to do a proper rate design along the lines Jim described.
We have numerous publications and presentations on rate design, and if you go to our website and search for Smart Rate Design, it will take you to a landing page that has half a dozen publications and 3 or 4 webinars on that subject.
Okay, great, thanks. The questions on time of use talk about the structure that might be best, or how utilities and commission should be thinking about time of use structures. And the way that some of the questions are worded pertain to how that could encourage electrification of transportation or space heating, as we've been talking about this afternoon.
So there are 2 things that I think are simple and important. The first is that the on-peak period should be defined as narrowly as the utility's resource mix and cost structure allows. Sacramento did a great deal of analysis of this and settled on 3 hours for the on-peak period. They have a 3-period rates, on-peak, mid-peak, and off-peak. And by focusing customers on a narrow of just a few hours a day, they find that customers are willing to make significant changes, to change when they do laundry, to change when they do dishes, possibly to change their thermostat setting, turn off lights, turn off office equipment, if it's for a relatively short period. The other half of the equation is to try to align the low-cost hours to the low-emission hours, at least at a minimum, take emissions into account when setting time-of-use rates. 20 years ago, in the Pacific Northwest, we had a time-of-use pilot that had the lowest prices in the middle of the night, and during the evaluation process, it turned out those were hours where coal was usually at the margin in the region. Now, that's 20 years ago. That's not true today in the Northwest, and the same analysis would produce a different result. I haven't done it, so I can't tell you what it is. But part of the conclusion was that the time of use rate was not cost effective because it failed to convey that that there was a carbon cost associated with increased usage at night. And as systems are evolving, often wind is now the marginal resource. At night, we've had a fair amount of wind curtailment in both the Northwest and in California when there's not enough load to absorb it. So finding the low cost hours and on the system, taking emissions into account is the other important thing in a TOU structure.
I think it's fair to say, Nancy, that time of use, integrating renewables into the system, and beneficial electrification, at least as it applies to water heating and electric vehicles, will go hand in hand. Some good examples are in the central north with Great River Energy, where it worked with one of its distribution co-ops, Steel Waseca, to pair a solar panel at a discounted rate, as long as the co-op member, the end customer, also took a grid-integrated water heater. And the combination of the two, of course, provided additional renewable generation of a small amount, but a great benefit in terms of peak reduction controllable by Great River and ancillary services provided by those water heaters as well. Similarly, Great River also had the opportunity with local wind generation that would otherwise didn't have enough demand at night, so that they would have to curtail. The generators said to Great River, we'd be glad to pay you some of the production tax credit if you can take the power at night. Great River said, we'd like to do that. What would we do with it? And they said, we'll charge our co-op members electric vehicles for free. If they had not done that, of course, those members would be charging their vehicles at some other time, and there would be less renewables on the system. So I think time of use, beneficial electrification, and integration of renewables will indeed go hand in hand.
Time of use rates may need to vary by season. The California ISO has put out a paper suggesting that in the spring months, which is now, that the lowest cost period of the day for California be the middle of the day when they have a surplus of solar, the duck belly problem. But in other months of the year, the middle part of the day not to be an off-peak period because there's enough load in the winter, or there's enough load in the summer and suppressed solar output in the winter that they don't wind up with a glut of solar. But that there are other months when wind power is particularly strong at night, where the super off-peak period would be invoked for the nighttime hours. You might actually wind up with electric vehicle owners charging at work in March, April, and May during the middle of the day, and charging at home in the other months of the year overnight with a grid operator controlling when the charging takes place, subject to the constraint of making sure the customer has the charge they need by morning. So time of use rates may need to vary by month if the utilities resource mix has very seasonal characteristics.
Great,
Next,
thanks very much, Ken and Jim. Thanks for the great questions we're receiving. We have a large number still to go, and we will stay on the line after the top of the hour for another half an hour to answer additional questions for those of you who can stay on the line. But I'd like to shift now to Ken for some closing comments, and then those of you who, and then I'll come back on and we will answer some additional questions for those who can stay on. Ken, you ready?
Wonderful. Thank you, Nancy. We thought it would be helpful today to conclude the webinar with some initial do's and don'ts for beneficial electrification. Many, I think, have already been alluded to in our questions and answers, but let me just run through them quickly. First, on the do list, do electrify things that use fossil fuels inefficiently. They are automatic consumers of more joules, so we don't need that. Second, look at the impact on customer cost. This is one of our key criteria, as you know, so always keep that first and foremost. Third, employ the most efficient technologies possible, especially heat pumps for space heating and water heating, and especially in new construction, per Jim's comment about building codes, for example. Fourth, understand that the electric power system is evolving over time, and what that may mean in terms of emissions and costs going forward. And in that context, fifth, analyze your electrification options with that in mind over their own relevant life. How do their life and use of electricity compare to your system's evolution? Then on the don'ts list, don't simply assume that electricity is cleaner than your existing fuel mix. It's certainly heading in that direction, as that EIA graph indicated. That improvement will continue over time, but as the colored matrix shows, that's not the case everywhere all the time at this time. So second, don't replace natural gas appliances with inefficient electric ones unless, and Jim made this point earlier as well, they can be controlled into low cost and or low carbon hours of the day. And then finally, don't install short-lived electric appliances if the fuel mix on your system is improving only slowly. That means that the devices will likely reach the end of their life before your system shows material improvement. By way of conclusions then, before we turn to the extra 30 minutes of questions, let me just indicate and wrap up that electrification is happening. It's happening rapidly due to advances in technology, but there are better and worse ways to do it. When done correctly, beneficial electrification can deliver multiple societal benefits. And that is if it adheres to the three criteria that we mentioned: lower total cost, lower environmental impact, and better grid management. In addition, if it applies the efficiency metric that we've been talking about throughout this webinar and follows prudent do's and don'ts. Finally, remember that beneficial electrification does not take the place of energy efficiency. A good way to conceptualize the two is working hand in hand. When you undertake energy efficiency efforts, you can use the resulting energy bonus of saved kilowatt hours to electrify another end use. The ultimate point in the last bullet is to utilize less raw energy, what we call joules, and to accomplish the end uses that society wants. This is trending toward being most effectively accomplished when more of those joules are in the form of electricity. That's what beneficial electrification is. Now, back on November 3rd, Jim and I did an introductory webinar about beneficial electrification with Keith Dennis of NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperatives Association, who has done pioneering work on beneficial electrification. Here in this webinar, we've tried to mention how to measure, how to think about, and provided examples for beneficial electrification. We recognize that our conclusions in today's webinar and these do's and don'ts are pretty general in nature, and RAP will be working over the next several months to develop and clarify specific policy recommendations. In the meantime, we'll answer as many questions as we can, and thank you all for joining today's webinar. Thank you, Nancy.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ken. I want to thank Ken and Jim for their insights and their expertise. We're going to conclude the official portion of the webinar. We thank you for choosing to spend some of your time today with us, and please look for the email tomorrow that will have the links to the slides and the recording of the webinar. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so let's go back to some of the questions. I want to start with one that came in about, do our numbers for when we do some of the charts like on the last slide include sort of life cycle emissions? We had a lot of questions about how, again, about our calculations and how much we've included in sort of upstream, in terms of upstream emissions, if you're talking about natural gas transmission or leaks and other things like that.
No, we have not included these. These are pretty simple calculations at the customer meter, how much natural gas is arriving, and then the efficiency of a natural gas, or how much oil is arriving, and the efficiency of an oil heating system or water heater or clothes dryer, and then how much electricity is arriving. So there, first of all, there's no consideration of the upstream costs or losses in either system here. There's also no consideration of the embedded energy required to generate the electricity to serve electrification, and or the embedded energy needed to create and maintain a oil or gas distribution system. All of those are very relevant questions, and the calculations that are on this chart are much, much simpler than that.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Jim. We also got a number of questions about peak impacts. What do we think electrification might do to peak impacts, or I guess I would add, what do we think is being done or could be done to not so we can avoid increasing peaks through electrification?
We've talked a lot about the need for, water heating in particular to be controlled into the low-cost, low-emission hours to prevent peak impacts. In cold climates that have winter peaks, converting oil or gas heat to heat pump will have peak impacts. They're not insignificant, and they need to be examined. Those should be examined and accounted for in a time-varying and seasonal rate design, and perhaps an inclining block rate design where you don't have the ability to do time-varying rates. That's kind of a proxy. Inclining block rate is kind of a proxy for a TOU rate, because high-use customers also tend to be peak-oriented customers. So rate design is an important part of getting the incentives right, so that the low-cost, low-emission hours are the cheap hours. And then when you do the consumer cost effectiveness, if you're shifting customers into a high-cost hour, the consumer cost effectiveness will fail, and the electrification will not meet our three criteria foundation for beneficial.
I think that's exactly right. Perhaps most easily put, Nancy, a logical, back the envelope consideration might indicate if we're going to electrify more things, we're going to make peaks worse. And that simply isn't the case for the reason that Jim just mentioned. In fact, by electrifying vehicles and electrifying water heaters and space heat, we gain more opportunities to tailor the shape of the load curve. And one result of intelligent tailoring of load curves is that you reduce peaks.
Okay, great. So a related question to this about peaks was the potential need for additional transmission and distribution infrastructure. If we end up with peaks, or perhaps not, hopefully, if we don't add peaks. But would either of you, want to comment on the potential need for additional transmission and distribution?
Transmission is usually unrelated to peak demand. Most transmission is built to either bring baseload resources such as coal or nuclear to the service territory, or to bring distant renewable resources, wind or solar, to the service territory. Peaks are usually met with peaking power plants, gas turbines that are located very close to the loads, so that we normally don't have to add transmission to serve peaks. But there certainly are times when it is necessary, and in the context that we're talking, adding a lot of wind and solar to the system, low carbon resources, many of them will be distant and will require transmission, and that should be part of the cost effectiveness analysis of adding those resources. We can mitigate the need for additional capacity and for peak by controlling as many of the loads as possible. And the ones we've talked about that are most controllable are the water heating loads, either a heat pump water heater or a electric resistance water heater can be controlled into low cost, low emission hours, and those will be ones when additional peaking capacity or transmission capacity is not required. And motor vehicles, where if there's lots of analysis showing that the overwhelming majority, 90+% of the automobile charging load can be handled during low cost and low emission hours if the infrastructure is in place to do that and the pricing is appropriate. So there will be, on the space heating side, some impacts, and our expectation is that as existing electric end uses become more efficient and sales decline due to efficiency, that beneficial electrification will mostly take up existing space in our capacity network, not require new. But there may be exceptions, and there may be peak impacts, and those will need to be analyzed on a location-specific basis.
And Nancy, I would just add that Jim is quite right about the possibility of impacts, but even that represents an opportunity in the sense of opportunity costs. What are the options? And the option or the concern that we're increasingly will be looking at, of course, is the climate impacts. And the grid will be getting cleaner over time. We do need to attend carefully to peaks. We can do that with many of the technologies Jim just described. Those same attributes are not characteristic of continuing to fuel transportation with petroleum or continuing space heat and water heat with natural gas over the long-term future.
Okay, great. Here's shifting gears a little bit. Well, maybe not quite too far, not very far. Folks wanted to hear about potential utility business models and ways we could provide incentives to utilities to pursue electrification.
Well, the one that I mentioned is the utility programs. We certainly have energy efficiency programs in most of our electric utilities. We have existing fuel conversion programs in some of our utilities that are going from electric to gas, which was a terrific idea 20 years ago when the marginal resources were expensive fossil resources or nuclear, very expensive resources. But not an appropriate program in some areas today where the marginal resources are cheap and clean. So changing those fuel conversion programs to look ahead rather than look back is important. Pragmatically, electric utilities have an incentive for electrification whenever their earnings are tied to their sales volumes, and that's true for most utilities today. For those that have full decoupling mechanisms, we may need to amend those decoupling mechanisms to recognize that sales growth may come with with cost growth that's unrelated to customer growth. So decoupling mechanisms may need to be updated to encourage some utilities to pursue electrification. But for those who aren't decoupled, I think they've got plenty of incentive. The challenge may be on the side of the fuels being converted from, and for regulators, the natural gas utility will see declining sales as electrification occurs, and ultimately they will need to adopt principles as to when natural gas line extensions are and are not appropriate, and when natural gas system renewals and replacements are or are not appropriate. So far, all of the studies of how to get to a high level of, or how to get emissions down by 80% seem to show that continued use of natural gas for residential space and water heating will need to be phased out. And that'll be a challenge for regulators with respect to the gas utilities.
Jim's allusion to decoupling and to a performance basis to regulation are themselves significant changes in existing volumetric business models, certainly, but they're hardly unprecedented or unrecognized at this point. And one of the important elements of beneficial electrification, I think, is that it puts the companies in the need to undertake a much closer relationship with their customers, engage more directly and on a variety of additional fronts. A lot of the calculations that Jim described, knowing your system, knowing what the load shape of the measures that you're anticipating would be and how those interface and when they should be run, a lot of that will be done automatically, but using the utilities data. So a lot of the business model changes that electrification might lend itself toward are those that are sort of in the cards anyway, increasingly, and that it's a way, as we indicated, that utilities can get a leg up.
Great, thanks to you both. That also helped address a question we had gotten about what did we expect the reaction or the actions that a gas utility might want to be thinking about as they see electrification coming. So let's, here's a question about a perspective of a program administrator that asks, do we think that we need a different approach to benefit cost screening for, to realize the benefits of emissions efficiency?
Well, yes, at least, in our criteria, the customer cost effectiveness is important. That's usually not a part of our utility program cost effectiveness analysis. That mostly looks at the system impacts. And so we've added one conventional metric, the participant impact test, to the total resource or societal cost test that a program administrator is now using. And then in addition, we've added the emission metric. And in regions where carbon is not yet priced, it's important for the program administrator to evaluate that. In regions where it is priced, that may be embedded in the system costs. So in the EU or California, for example, where carbon does carry a price, that might be already embedded into utility system costs. But in most of the US where carbon is not priced, the program administrator would need to consider that. So there's two additional bits of analysis required for a program administrator: consumer costs and carbon impacts.
And Jim didn't say it explicitly, but of course there may be the grid operator benefits as well. Those are as part of the utility cost test already, so they should be included, and just mention it to make sure they're explicit in that inclusion.
Okay, thank you. Here's a provocative question. Do we consider nuclear energy to be beneficial electrification?
I have included nuclear in the non-carbon category on the chart that folks are looking at, and if what you're measuring is carbon, nuclear is a low carbon resource. Existing nuclear may be very cost effective to operate. New nuclear is fabulously expensive to build. So if you're talking about existing nuclear or new nuclear, you might reach a very, very different economic question. And we haven't embodied any issues relating to waste or safety into the analysis at all.
Okay, thank you. So we were asked a question about renewable energy certificates, and can we make a comment, or the question actually said, could we offer a primer on renewable energy certificates and their role in decarbonizing our electric grids?
I don't think that, I don't see a direct connection. Jim, you may. Renewable energy certificates, of course, are a way to monetize for the developers the additional cost that may be the case with renewables, although that is declining or perhaps absent now that solar and wind have achieved or near achieved grid parity. So they are more like a currency or a medium of exchange than they are a driver, I think. Jim, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I have some thoughts. I'm not sure I have a good answer. One of the functions of RECs is to have an easy way of moving the theoretical benefits of renewable energy from one location to another. And that would not meet our criteria, because as this table shows, what matters is the marginal resource to the system to serve additional load. If you're converting load on my electric system and my utility does not have a renewable portfolio standard or a renewable obligation or carbon accounting, they might have a fairly dirty system, but nonetheless they might be developing some very attractive wind systems in their service territory and selling the RECs outside of the service territory. But what matters for emissioncy is what is the marginal resource on the system where the conversion is taking place. And that's looking at real resources, not the accounting for resources. And RECs, in essence, move the accounting for resources to service territories other than where the resources are produced. And if my utility is buying RECs, that doesn't mean its system is cleaner. And if it's selling RECs, it doesn't mean its system is dirtier. We have to look through the accounting to the real resources to determine what is the marginal resource.
Great, Jim. I think that's helpful in terms of sort of explaining the role of RECs in different programs and how it affects this. We got a question about smart meters or sort of additional infrastructure that would be needed at the customer level. And what do we see as the role of adding smart meters, or are smart meters necessary to provide the incentives and the information to the utilities? The question said to reduce peak demand, but just demand in general, I would say, and also helping with electric vehicles and heat pump transitions.
For some of these things, having time of use data is going to be very important. But for example, the resource I've got circled here, the water heating resource, we can handle water heating with a virtual time varying rate simply by allowing the grid operator or the utility to control when the water heater is charging. And the customer gets a flat bill credit, and that's the way most current curtailable water heat and curtailable air conditioning programs work. It's not a time of use rate, but the utility turns off the water heater during peak hours, or a timer controls it during peak hours, and the customer gets a $10 or $15 a month credit for participating in the program. So some of these can be done without advanced metering, but clearly time varying prices, critical peak pricing, the things we talk about in smart rate design, are easier and more effectively implemented with advanced metering of some kind, at least for the participating customers. And if a system doesn't have AMI and doesn't have smart meters, but there's a few hundred customers that have electric vehicles, you can put those customers on a time of use rate and install a cellular meter at their house and put them on a TOU rate that reports smart data back to the utility, even though all of their neighbors are still on conventional meters. So the answer is we can do an awful lot of this without advanced metering, but over half of American households now have advanced meters, and they're producing an increasing variety of benefits. I think that over the life of any of the appliances we're talking about, they will become nearly universal around the country.
I think that's right, Nancy, and as the Internet of Things pervades and devices, refrigerators, washing machines, so forth, increasingly have chips in them. Some of those chips will be Wi-Fi, and the Internet of Things will be able to operate over Wi-Fi, or as Jim mentioned, radio-controlled cellular, so forth. So we're not limited to the utility meters. The utility meters, Jim indicated, may be most useful in the information that it conveys to the household about real-time pricing, rather than information it collects from the household.
Okay, that's great. Can you, in one of your closing slides, you talked about the need for energy efficiency. So maybe you could elaborate on this. The question we got was, don't we still need a huge amount of energy efficiency to make the whole process work?
Well, I think the answer is yes and no. We can create, as Jim said, through the managing loads to the low cost and low emission times of day, we can tailor the load curve. And a lot of that can be done with the existing infrastructure and using non-efficient or less efficient devices. So there's a lot of headroom, if you will, now when you look at what the system's capable of delivering in terms of peaks versus what its average loads are. Beneficial electrification can help fill that headroom. But the bigger question, I think, is why would you want to do that? Because using the energy efficiency approach just dramatically reduces the cost of doing it all. So I think that we can go a long way in the direction of electrification without focusing on efficiency, but it's always wise to focus on efficiency. So in no way would we want beneficial electrification to be a reason to set aside concerted efficiency efforts.
Yeah, if we're going to convert people from oil or gas space heat to heat pump space heat, we should be making sure they're getting very efficient Energy Star heat pumps. But on the other hand, if your utility is curtailing wind in the middle of the night and curtailing solar in the middle of the day, as is happening this spring in California, having some electric resistance water heaters that can be installed virtually anywhere in a closet very easily and cheaply, that can be controlled into those hours. It's not a very efficient way to use electricity, but if that electricity is otherwise going to be wasted, curtailed, there may be some places where giving up some efficiency in exchange for some economy focused on key hours that are cheap and clean may be desirable. And we get down to the automobile. Is a Tesla energy efficiency measure? Well, no, not compared to a Nissan Leaf. The Tesla S gets about 3 miles per kilowatt hour and the Leaf gets 4. but compared to using petroleum, both of them are emission and in terms of overall joules required, efficient.
Okay, I want to do one more, and then I was going to ask you both if there was something you wish you'd been asked. But let me raise this one where, and we've gone over this a little bit, but I think it warrants going back, is what about areas of the country where gas prices are lower than electric prices? How do we think that affects beneficial electrification?
That will affect the consumer cost effectiveness and the societal cost effectiveness calculation that both belong in any kind of a fuel conversion framework. Obviously, societal belongs in any utility programmatic analysis, and we've added the consumer cost effectiveness because you don't want to force customers onto something that's going to add cost to them. The key will be how efficient and how economical is the conversion, and do the time of use electric prices make electricity in the low cost, low emission hours competitive or more than competitive with gas. If we can't accomplish all of those, then we're not going to move folks. And there's no embarrassment to that. I guess one would need to consider whether carbon costs are being considered both in the conversion analysis and in the continued natural gas service analysis. That's not a lot of regions of the country are applying a carbon price to natural gas yet, even at the analytical level, and that's maybe an imbalance that should be addressed.
I don't have much to add there, Nancy. I'm reminded of the physician's oath to first do no harm, and I think if curtailing is going on, then as Jim indicates, utilities should make darn sure that rate design encourages beneficial electrification so that we are first doing no waste, and that those kilowatt hours are not dumped and they're taken advantage of.
Okay, so we just have about 3 minutes left, and I thought I'd give you both an opportunity to, if there was a question you wished you'd been asked, or something that might, some of the things, the other questions raised that you thought you might, that you'd like to add. I don't know which, if one of you wants to go first, or.
I go ahead, Jim, if you.
I'll go ahead. The question I didn't get asked is how many people are actually doing some of these programs? And I've gone back here to the No You Don't Run Out of Hot Water slide to talk for just a minute about some of the regions where controlled water heating is taking place. So far it's all controlled electric resistance water heating. The largest program I know of is in France, Electricity de France, which has a time of use rate that's limited to customers with controlled hot water heaters. Great River Energy, which Ken mentioned, has about 1,000 megawatts of water heaters under grid operator control now. The electric utility in New Brunswick, Canada, as part of the Power Shift Canada program, began installing in their water heater lease program grid integrated water heaters. PJM, I understand, has contracted for a fleet of about 30,000 grid integrated electric resistance water heaters in order to primarily provide ancillary services to the grid. And Hawaii has a couple of pilots underway, and I'm hoping we'll be moving to a full deployment into the multifamily housing sector where solar water heating is not really an option. The condo over there. Those of you who've been to Hawaii and stayed in the condos are only plumbed for cold water, so installing a central solar system on the roof of a multifamily building would be a massive construction project. And I'm kind of hoping they will have a full rollout to the tens of thousands of tourist condos in Hawaii to allow them to run on solar during the day, as this slide shows, charging up in the middle of the day, on wind in the middle of the night, as this slide shows, charging up from 1 to 6 a.m. During low-cost, low-emission hours. We've got people moving ahead on some of this stuff, and I'm optimistic that more will happen. Ken?
My question, I think, Nancy, would have been, how does beneficial electrification relate to power sector transformation as a whole? And that'll be among the areas RAP will continue to look into going forward. But just as a cap of that, I would suggest that we are here because of advancing technologies that have given us these abilities. Those developments will not stop. They will continue. And so we'll be more and more facing greater and greater opportunities with respect to our grid and our devices that the grid serves. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you both for those closing comments. We are at the end of the additional half hour, so our great thanks to Ken Colburn and Jim Lazar, and thank you all as well for the audience for joining us and for those of you who could stick around for the additional half hour. Look for the email tomorrow with the link to the slides and the recording. Thank you all. Goodbye.